So first tell me, you said you're staying in place. What are you the most concerned about when it comes to Milton as it approaches?
Well, Milton is a very powerful storm, and it's hitting a very dense and weak in general from a building side area. So obviously, loss of life is the first priority in all those situations, and absolute evacuation, I think at this point is a necessity. Nobody should stay there, period. The other side is what people will find when they go back. And many people will have lost everything, I'm afraid, and will have to start from scratch. Um, some others may have just damage, um, and probably those who have built to more high standards above the code will find just minimal damage. But this will be extensive for both homes, buildings, and the infrastructure.
What have these recent hurricanes, both Helene and Milton, taught you?
Well, it's taught me that we have to respect the forces of nature. We cannot be gambling with nature. And I myself, having been in the building industry, having lived through disasters, I was also in the World Trade Center 9/11. And, I don't play with probabilities. I consider hazards to be a certainty, and therefore I like to mitigate against them. I'm not going to gamble and say, well, I have a 50% chance, should I do it or not? I say I have a 100% chance and I'm going to do. So,
What do people need to know about the types of structures that are in this part of Florida that's in this cone of uncertainty?
well, one of the important elements here is the elevation. Florida is not all flat. There are elevated parts of, Tampa. But I like to say if you're below 10 feet from the water level, and that water level can be the sea, can be a lake, can be a river, even can be a dry creek, as we've seen in Asheville just a couple weeks ago. You're kind of in a red light area, in terms of, you got to think, what am I going to do to mitigate myself? I like to be at least 15 feet above water. And when I say, 15 feet, I mean the first occupied floor of my house or my building to be at that elevation. So, I think it's important for everyone to look at where they are and understand what their elevation is. The second is so location is the first, what is the risk of your location? The second is how well was the house built? Unfortunately, our codes are meant to protect life, to give us enough time to escape the building or the house, but not to save the house. And most people don't realize that the codes are set at a low level, basically to get you out, not to have a place to get back. So if you want to save the house, if you want to save your possessions, your egg nest and so forth, you have to be looking at going above code. So code is the minimum. It's like minimum wage or anything, and we're not educated to think that way, that we need to be asking for above code features when we're buying and when we're replacing and renovating, the roof, just don't put a code roof back on, put an above code roof, the siding of the house, put something that will resist more wind and fire and other things, we do from time to time. So, we need that education, and that's kind of become the focus of what I try to do since I retired about 10 years ago.
When is rebuilding not a good idea? So often we see these communities um, just so devastated by the damage, but they are committed to rebuilding. With this
Yeah.
change in the climate, should we now be thinking twice about that?
We definitely should, Michelle. And for me, the criteria is the location. As I mentioned, if you're below 10 feet elevation from water, probably you shouldn't be rebuilding. Because if you rebuild, it's going to cost you quite a bit to elevate. You're going to have to put high piles and all the inconvenience and expense that goes with that. So look at a different location. Look at somewhere where it's higher ground. If you're very close to a forest, if you're next to the forest right there, and you can't create a boundary around you, to protect your house, you probably should be looking elsewhere. Don't rebuild right there in the same forest, So location is for me the most important criteria to that rebuilding. and water and fire are much more location specific. Obviously, earthquakes are also location specific. You don't want to be building right over a fault, but an earthquake can travel for dozens, if not hundreds of miles. So, water and fire, if your location is too risky, do not rebuild.
Do you think most of the Eastern Seaboard is prepared for what climate change is going to be dishing out in these years ahead?
No, we're not prepared, unfortunately. We're not prepared as consumers, and we're not prepared as governments. And, we kind of think that, okay, the government's going to do it for us, but it doesn't happen that way. I think all of us have to learn how to make ourselves, our houses more resilient. And I like to say that 80% of the resilience is the moment you buy a house. Pretty much the location and type of house is fixed. The other, let's say 15 or so percent is what you do after you buy it to improve it. And less than 5% is what you do in the days or hours before the hazard strikes. Unfortunately, government spends 80% of their time focused on the 5%, and we need to get people thinking more about, where they're living and what they're living in. And that requires a lot more education that we haven't been giving, to our consumers.
Given the pattern that we're seeing right now, this appears to be a problem that will be very costly in the future.
Yes, unfortunately, we're all gonna, there's gonna be heavy losses. People who have saved, their savings get eroded after disaster, even if they have insurance. I've witnessed in communities. I was up in Mexico Beach like 3-4 years after Michael hit them, and people are taking 5 to 10 years in general to recover, and are eating into their savings and are having to borrow more. So at the individual level, yeah, it's going to be very costly, but also at the community level and the state and even federal level, it's going to, chew up our money that we should be using for other things, just fighting these disasters. So we've got to do something, and that something is we've got to raise our standards. We like to keep the standards low in the past because we said, well, that's the way we're going to make houses affordable. But we realize now that that's false affordability. In other words, we're paying for things 2 and 3 times and creating a lot of personal suffering when we're not in a strong house that can resist the nature. So we've got to do better.
And we're talking about Florida today, but we have the Eastern Shore. I'm talking to you from the DC area, and that could face a similar threat as well, you say?
Yeah, there's no, these storms can travel along the Atlantic, and even if they don't bring as strong winds, they can dump a lot of water, as we saw in North Carolina. So flooding is a factor and a risk all over the country, I like to say. There's no part of the country that doesn't have that risk. But also from the wind side, tornadoes have expanded beyond what we used to call the traditional tornado alley. We're seeing tornadoes throughout the Midwest. We're seeing them in the Appalachian area. We're seeing them even east of the Appalachia area. So, when you think of, what should be the wind rating for a house, don't just expect the hurricane, think about the tornadoes that may be coming.
So who's responsible? One of the things you pointed out was we need to raise the standard for our buildings. Is that the county? Is that the state? How do we go about making these changes?
Well, in the US, we have a very fragmented system of building regulation, which basically relies on each state creating their own regulations. Now, there are some models that the states can follow, but they basically can tinker and typically water down those models. And then even in some states, the counties can select to have or not have codes. So at the federal level, we have a federal government that essentially is just paying money, and also backing mortgages. So I'd like to see the federal government getting a bit stricter in its lending to say, if you don't have codes, then we're not going to give you the best rates. We're not even going to be lending in your state or in your county for 30 years. We're only going to be lending for 15 years. So create financial incentives from the federal level so that states raise their standards.
And Aris, you're an expert at Florida International University's Resilient Sea Level Solutions Center and Extreme Events Institute. Tell me about some of the research that you're doing there.
We're very fortunate that Florida International University, we have the center called Wall of Wind, which is one of the largest testing facilities where we can test different types of homes, buildings, subcomponents, roofs, walls against winds. So we have accumulated a lot of knowledge that we've used in Florida particularly, but can be used all over the country. We're also planning now a even bigger facility with the National Science Foundation. It's a study currently underway to create a combined wind and water testing facility that will simulate in full scale both hurricanes and storm surges. And hopefully that will be something that we'll see built in the next 5 years or so. So from the academic side, we know what we have to do. We have the knowledge. We don't have to invent anything new. The key is let's apply it. Let's make it happen in the actual practice. That's what we're missing.
And tell me about some of the images that you sent over to me. Are those the type of mitigating tools that people will, who don't necessarily have a home that's built to code would need to install?
Well, those are things that if your home, for example, doesn't have hurricane rated windows, you know, and I like to say your windows should be at least, even in the north, should be at least 135 miles an hour. Down in Florida, they need to be like 180 miles an hour. But if you're not at that level, you know, these are different solutions like fabrics, similar to what, you know, airbags in cars look like, that can be installed pretty easily and quickly over doors and windows. And also there are things that you can do kind of to keep the water from getting inside your walls, coatings both inside the house and outside the house, and different like barriers. But I caution that these only work for kind of low level hazards, low level, you know, flooding. So, I mean, if it's 1 foot of flooding or even, you know, maybe a foot and a half, they'll work. But anything above that, you know, you need to elevate the house. You know, you need to do something structurally to fix it. So, you know, these things help, but they're not the ultimate solution.
And I know Floridians are used to hurricanes, but I think the back-to-back nature of Helene and now Milton, which appears to be a monster storm, it's really a wake-up call for a lot of folks.
It definitely is, because we have now on the ground a lot of debris that cannot be collected quick enough, and that debris with the wind coming will essentially behave like missiles. So the buildings will not only have water and wind, they'll also have objects striking them. You know, and anything built of wood, you know, my estimations, it will be destroyed, you know, from that combination. So it is a wake-up call. I've been to Tampa many times. I was there filming a second documentary that will be out later this year called Built to Last, Buyer Beware. And I was appalled by how much construction was being done with wood. You know, construction that maybe could withstand a Cat 2, but definitely not a Cat 4. So it's a wake-up call. And it's been many decades in the making, the vulnerability that we have. Miami learned their lesson after Andrew in 92, and it's been 30 plus years since then. But the rest of the state, the rest of the Gulf Coast, and the rest of the Southern Atlantic coast needs to do what Miami does for wind, for hurricanes. And we're not doing it, you know?
What would you say are the three takeaways, the three next steps that people need to take?
When you're buying, take a close look at the vulnerability of the locations. Don't just look at the appearance, the curb appeal, and the cosmetics. Know what the hazards are, water, wind, and so forth of that particular house. Sometimes it requires asking a lot of questions and talking to experts. Number two, prioritize resilience in any renovations, remodeling, and repairs that you do. In other words, it's better to save your house than to invest, let's say, in upgrading the kitchen, the bathroom, and have everything lost in a storm. So put that first, you know, ahead of anything. And the third thing is, be aware of what you're doing as you kind of, move around. You're traveling. You're staying in hotels. You're staying in different places. Look around and assess the hazards, assess the location hazards wherever you go, because a lot of us kind of, do move around, and sometimes we get stuck in locations or buildings that may be unsafe. So those three takeaways I'd like to kind of convey.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I appreciate you communicating this, because for me, public education is the key to the future, and consumer education. And I think if consumers start asking for these things, like we ask for organic products, we ask for, better, cars and so forth. We look at the safety record of cars. If we start asking for them, the suppliers will provide it. And if the market is moving in that direction, the policymakers will come behind and make the policies. So, I like to say consumers will drive the potential change that we need.
When does that documentary release that you mentioned?
Hopefully it'll be out, this November.
Okay.
We're circulating amongst a number of channels to see, which one would like to pick it up. And I think there's considerable interest after this series of storms. I made another documentary 3 years ago called Built to Last with a question mark. It's available to view through my website, buildingresilient.com. And also you'll see a lot of other information there. And I'm writing my second book now that will be focused on the economics of resilience, talking even more specifically to consumers, and hope to have that out beginning of next year.
And finally, the fund that you have.
Yes, the Resilience Action Fund is a 501c3 nonprofit. Its core mission is to educate consumers on what they can do to make their homes and their communities more resilient to hazards. So I've tried, through many ways to kind of get the message at a level where anybody can understand it. Because sometimes, technical people talk too technically, and nobody, can understand them. So I'm trying to communicate some things. I even came up with a cartoon series called Ask Uncle Rezi that you'll see on my website, just to take it to the school level. And I think we've got to start with our children in schools, talking to them about resilience, because they are the future consumers. They are the future home buyers and owners, and hopefully they'll do better than us.
Absolutely. And there are definitely some of them, unfortunately, learning hard lessons living through these storms that can be very traumatic emotionally for young people and families who experience it. So we thank you for your time, appreciate the work you're doing, and I'm sure we will talk again.
Thank you, Michelle. Really appreciate you doing